welcome. I'm Gail Sassnett, Associate Director of the Bob Graham Center for Public Service. Thank you so much for being here tonight. We are very happy to co-sponsor this Irish panel with UF's College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Political Science Department, International Center, Center for European Studies, and the Manning Dower Eminent Chair in Political Science. Did I get them all?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. After the talk, we will have time for Q&A. We'll put the microphone here, and we'll remind you you will need to come to the microphone because we're streaming and recording this, and you won't be picked up. Your question won't be picked up unless you do come to the microphone. Remind you, please turn off your cell phones. And now Dr. Richard Conley, who is an Associate Professor of Political Science, is going to introduce our guest.
Thank you, Gail. First, let me thank the Bob Graham Center for Public Service for sponsoring or co-sponsoring this event. It's a couple of days of events. We have this evening's public forum, and then tomorrow we have a full day conference in the Department of Political Science. But let me thank former Provost David Colburn for his support, and certainly Gail Sassnett, whom you just met, for all of her efforts in coordinating this. It takes a lot of moving parts to make this sort of event happen. And on that note, I'd like to thank my co-organizer, Leanne Brown, in the Department of Political Science, my dear friend and cherished colleague, whom I had the great pleasure of going to Ireland with back, it's hard to believe, it's been 10 years, yes. We took a group of 14 students to Dublin. Actually, we have someone here from Dublin City University, which hosted us at the dorms and gave us classroom space for that 6-week program. And I'm happy to report, especially as someone who studied France and taken quite a number of students to France, we often think of France as the place of love, l'amour. And over time, I learned from 2008 forward that 6 of our 14 students ended up either fiancéed or married. So that says something about the charm of Ireland. That was not an intent of Leanne Brown nor I, but it happened. So certainly something to think about. But in any event, we're here tonight because tomorrow, at least according to the liturgical calendar, and I'll share something with you. When I had started contacting all of our fine conferees for this conference, I said, well, would the 3rd week or the 4th week of March work better for you? And everyone universally came back and said the 4th week of March, Thursday, Friday. I said, okay, great. As a good Catholic, I guess I should have looked at the liturgical calendar. And I happened to call up a very good friend of mine whom I've known for 20 some odd years, Father John Gillespie. Some of you might know him over at St. Augustine's when he was the head priest there at the Catholic Student Union. I said, Father John, I said, you know, you're of Irish background. I said, would you like to come to this conference? And he said, well, Rich, he said, under normal circumstances, I'd be delighted, but I'll be engaging in my pastoral duties. And I said, well, what on earth do you mean? He said, well, Rich, that's Good Friday. And I said, oh, heaven. I said, I didn't even think about that. I said, I didn't check the calendar. I said, I feel like an idiot. And he said, well, that's one way to look at it. And then he said, the other is that you're brilliant. You actually brought everybody together on the exact day, at least according to the liturgical calendar, for Good Friday, which in 1998 signified some very important things for Northern Ireland. And on that vein, let me just say, for those of you who might not be altogether familiar with the situation in Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Accords were brokered. It was really multilateral talks that brought the situation to some sort of conclusion back on Good Friday 20 years ago. The United States, I think, happily played a very important role. The Clinton administration had sent former Senator from Maine, George Mitchell, to try to jumpstart things. He was joined by Prime Minister Tony Blair of the United Kingdom. The Taoiseach, I guess, in the Republic, they would never say Prime Minister, but for all intents and purposes, the leader of the Dáil Éireann, Albert Reynolds, joined in. And then it came down to negotiating with the Catholic nationalists and Protestant loyalist parties in Northern Ireland to try to come to a solution for what had rocked Ulster, those 6 counties in the north, for 40 years. By most academic accounts, some 3,300 or more civilians who died during the Troubles, these periods of paramilitaries operating, very difficult situation. And so we're here this evening and again tomorrow to try to look at what's happened since the Good Friday Accords. One of the things I would point out the Good Friday Accords did was to try to find solutions to very difficult questions, such as the release of political prisoners. Some of you, if you're of my age or older, you might remember the hunger strikers at the Maze prison or Longkesh in County Armagh that Bobby Sands had originally begun. And so the political prisoners were released, but that's been a difficult proposition, as I think my colleague and I learned firsthand on the ground in talking with folks who weren't able to get jobs because they were classified as felons. So it was very difficult, even after their release. The laying down or decommissioning of arms by paramilitary groups on both sides was really a very important event in development in trying to find peace in an otherwise very troubled place. And ultimately, I would say for political scientists, we have a great experiment in Northern Ireland. We have a power-sharing government. Some of you might be familiar, hopefully, with the work of Arent Leipart, formerly of the University of California, San Diego, who wrote a lot about these power-sharing agreements. How do we protect minority rights but have a functional type of government? And Northern Ireland has been on that path, albeit by fits and starts. It was, roughly 8 years between 1998 and 2006 until the government got up and running. And now today we face some real challenges in the province of Ulster. We have a situation in which there is no current government. As one of our colleagues was telling me yesterday and the day before, there's no unionist majority, there's no loyalist majority in Stormont, the Legislative Assembly in Belfast, and there may be some strategic reasons why there hasn't been an executive formed, and I'm sure all of our guests tonight will maybe want to weigh in on that. But it's a very difficult position, and some of the issues that have divided the two sides tend to focus on culture, on education, some of the more symbolic issues, and these have always been a very difficult pathway forward. We also have something very, very important happening, which is Brexit, the British exit from the European Union. And what I would convey this evening is that it's important to remember that while Scotland, Wales, and England voted narrowly to leave the European Union. Scotland didn't. I'm sorry, but Wales and England did. Both communities in the north voted by fairly substantial majorities to remain part of the European Union. So what does this mean? Because the EU has been a very important player in trying to resolve some of these cross-community conflicts. So I would offer that as a kind of context for tonight's discussion. Anyway, without going into further detail, let me introduce some of our folks here this evening who have traveled from far and away to come here. I had the pleasure of meeting them in Orlando, with all of its wonderful traffic, which delayed some things here and there, but they've been all very patient. And I'll go in alphabetical order. So the first to my right here is Maria Adriana Deiana. She is a lecturer in international relations in the School of Law and Government at Dublin City University. As I learned happily, she is a native of Sardinia in Italy, and so she's been correcting my poor Italian that I learned 30 years ago, and I've most enjoyed that. But Professor Deiana's research draws on feminist approaches to war and security and focuses on gender dynamics of conflict and post-conflict transformation, the emergence of the Women, Peace, and Security, or WPS agenda, as a dominant framework for the articulation of gender concerns in conflict, crisis management, and security. She has also conducted research that investigates cross-border cooperation as an instrument of EU border policies and conflict transformation. And her focus in terms of research is on both former Yugoslavia as well as Northern Ireland and EU border politics and peacekeeping. She's currently a co-convener of the British International Studies Association Working Group on Southeast Europe. She joined Dublin City University's School of Law and Government in 2016 to work with one faculty member, Dr. Ken McDonough, and his Irish Research Council funded project, quote, Add Women and Hope, assessing the gender impact of EU common security and defense policy missions. So she explores some of the intersections between the women and peace and security agenda and EU missions, and the project offers some new insights on the progress and challenges in mainstreaming gender into EU peacekeeping practices. I'd also like to happily report that her 2008 book, entitled Gender and Citizenship, Promises of Peace in Post-Dayton Bosnia-Herzegovina with Palgrave Macmillan, examines the remaking of women's citizenship in the aftermath of that very important international conflict and intervention of which the United States, Canada, and others were involved. In that very important work, she develops a feminist critique of consociationalism as a dominant model of post-conflict governance by tracking the gendered implications of the Dayton Peace Agreement. And that book illustrates how the legitimization of ethno-nationalist power enabled by the agreement has in fact reduced citizenship to an all-encompassing logic of ethno-national belonging and implicitly reproduced its attendant patriarchal gender order. It's very much an important work that some of you, I hope, will want to take up and take a look at just out with Palgrave Macmillan. To my other right here is Adrian Guelke. He is Professor Emeritus at Queen's University in Belfast. I've had a wonderful opportunity to get to know Professor Guelke the last couple of days, as jet-lagged as he has obviously been, coming from Belfast to Dublin and then off to Orlando. But Professor Guelke's principal interests are in the politics of deeply divided societies, most particularly the cases of South Africa, of which he is a native, and Northern Ireland. He has a special interest in comparison of divided societies and the role that comparison has played in their politics. I think this is very important for those of us who have an interest in comparative politics. Case studies are very, very important and sometimes get a little bit of short shrift in political science these days, particularly for those of us in American politics like I am most of the time. In the past, Professor Guelke has done a considerable amount of research on political violence, both in divided societies and more generally. This research has prompted him to carry out a study recently of terrorism, a subject that also fits into his interest in the international dimensions of international conflicts and crossing the boundaries between international relations and comparative politics. His most recent book is entitled Politics in Deeply Divided Societies by Polity Press back in 2012. And he argues that the end of the Cold War and the reorganization of global politics along less dualistic lines did not create divided societies, although it did facilitate the breakup of once stable states into smaller and smaller polities, often along ethnic and or religious lines, as people began to vie anew for their right of self-determination. Obviously, this has opened up a number of new challenges for national and global governance, challenges that necessitate the development of an authoritative introductory survey of the phenomenon for both students and policymakers. Professor Guelke is very well published over the course of his career, but I would just mention a few of his important books that you may want to consult. Include Rethinking the Rise and Fall of Apartheid with Palgrave Macmillan in 2005, The Challenges of Ethno-Nationalism, Case Studies in Identity Politics and Global Change, Civil Society and the Northern Ireland Peace Process, Implementing the Political Settlement, again with Palgrave Macmillan back in 2008, and many, many others. So definitely we're very happy to have Professor Guelke here as well. And last but certainly not least on the alphabetical order is Brendan O'Leary. He is Lauder Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania, here to my left. Very happy to have him here this evening. Professor O'Leary is an Irish and U.S. citizen, and since 2003 has been the Lauder Professor of Political Science at Penn. He is the co-author or co-editor of 22 books, an inspiration to all of us. He's the author or co-author of over 120 articles or chapters in peer-reviewed journals, university presses, as well as numerous other publications. He's also the inaugural winner of the Juan Linz Prize of International Political Science Association, presented to him in Istanbul, Turkey, back in 2016. Again, for some of my students in the audience, you might remember a few of the articles that I may have assigned to you from Juan Linz about presidentialism versus parliamentary systems. Very important literature, still very relevant today. Professor O'Leary is the series editor of National and Ethnic Conflict in the 21st Century with Penn Press. And he has been a political and constitutional advisor to a number of groups, including the United Nations, the European Union, the Kurdistan Regional Government of Iraq, the governments of the UK and Ireland, and the British Labour Party during the Irish peace process. He holds a BA in honors from the University of Oxford in philosophy, politics and economics, as well as a PhD that won the Robert Mackenzie Memorial Prize at the London School of Economics and Political Science back in 1988. And I would note that Professor O'Leary's academic career has been combined with quite a bit of constitutional advisory work. For example, he advised the Irish, British, and American ministers and officials and the Irish-American Morrison delegation during the Northern Ireland peace process back several decades ago. He's appeared in an expert witness before the U.S. Congress. I'm not sure about the wisdom of appearing before Congress these days. Congress is a bit dysfunctional these days, but I'm glad you came out okay. He was a guest of the White House back in 1994, 1995, 1998, and in fact his perspectives on power sharing are thought to have been highly influential during the Irish peace process. Someone who's coming tomorrow, his colleague from Canada, John McGarry, with whom Professor O'Leary has worked. They have worked on things such as police reform, and if you know Northern Ireland, that's been a very essential issue, and seemingly here in the U.S. one as well. Professor O'Leary and Professor McGarry were singled out in the press for influencing the Independent Commission on Police Reform, which reported back in 1999. I could go on. He's done quite a bit of work for the EU as well as the UN in terms of Somalia, in South Africa and Nepal. But suffice it to say, we're very, very pleased to have all three of our guests here this evening who have endured quite a bit of travel time and time zone shenanigans. They're all a little bit jet lagged, and we're just very happy to have each and every one of them here to share the Gator Nation and welcome them here to the University of Florida and partake in our little corner of the Sunshine State, which we certainly hold very special amongst us. So on that note, I guess as moderator, I'll start out things here. We can go kind of right to left or left to right. It doesn't matter, but The most important question, I think, to start off very broadly is, in thinking back 20 years ago, which some of us remember, what has been the most important positive change to Northern Ireland in light of the Good Friday Accords, and what have been perhaps the more negative or maybe unexpected consequences of the institutional structure that was struck at that time? And we can kind of maybe go on from there. Professor Guelke, would you like to tackle that one?
Yeah, okay, but I mean, I think to be fair to the audience, I should say a bit about. Yeah, to be fair to the audience. Closer to my mouth, is that better? Okay, sorry about that. Look, I think in fairness to the audience, I should say what is happening at the moment a little bit, because just fill in a bit of background to the breakdown of power sharing and the breakdown of the Good Friday Agreement. Tomorrow was meant to be a celebration of the Good Friday Agreement. Unfortunately, there's not much to celebrate at the moment in terms of what's happening to the institutions. We haven't had an effective functioning, a fully effectively functioning government in Northern Ireland since January last year, January 2017, for a fairly bizarre kind of reason, I must admit. The previous year, 2016, in the second half of the year, I went to South Africa to teach at the University of Cape Town, and I was telling the students in Cape Town that, you know, the Northern Ireland process was really working very well, and despite the outcome of the Brexit referendum, they'd got over that particular bump, or seemed to have, and that the power sharing government seemed to be operating okay. And I came back, and I flew back into Dublin, and I was on the bus with a guy called Brendan McAllister, who said to me, "Have you heard about this cash for ash scandal?" And I hadn't a clue what he was talking about. Now, what happened was that the government in Northern Ireland introduced a scheme whereby if you burnt wood chips, you got a subsidy. Now, that was quite a common scheme in lots of places, a sort of environmental scheme to encourage people to use wood chips in biomass boilers, which was supposed to be environmentally more friendly ways of creating heat. Unfortunately, in the Northern Ireland case, they didn't put in a clause that said if the price of wood chips falls below the level of the subsidy, then you're not going to get the subsidy. So what happened was that the price of wood chips fell to the point where the people who had biomass boilers could burn all day long in the summer, and they could heat empty barns, and they could use as much wood chips as they could get their hands on, and the government was going to pay them, pay them money for this. The end result is it looks like Northern Ireland it's going to cost the Northern Ireland taxpayer, and there are less than 2 million Northern Ireland citizens. It's going to cost the Northern Ireland taxpayer £400 million. There's a lot of money to lose on a scheme like this. And the issue came up about who should take responsibility for it. And basically, the minister who'd been responsible at the time was now the First Minister, Arlene Foster. And basically, the DUP said, no, officials were responsible for this, basically, which I think to some extent has been borne out by the inquiry that's gone into this matter. But the tradition in Britain is you don't blame officials, you take responsibility when things go wrong. And basically, Arlene Foster was not prepared to step aside even for a few weeks while there was an inquiry into the matter. The parties in opposition to Sinn Féin and the DUP, which had taken the opposition benches in a new arrangement, you didn't have to be in government, you could stay outside government, were baying for blood and demanding that there should be resignations and insisting that Sinn Féin should pull the plug on this, which eventually they did in January 2017, after coming under an enormous amount of pressure. Elections which were then held to the Northern Ireland Assembly and produced a very different result to the elections of the previous May, in the previous May, the Unionists had done rather well in the elections, although in terms of seats, the outcome was more or less identical to the 2011 elections. But in terms of votes, Unionist voters were more motivated to vote than Nationalist voters, it seemed, in the 2016 elections. But now things reversed, and Nationalist voters came out in large numbers, partly because of what was said during the campaign by the Unionist Party leaders, particularly in the Democratic Unionist Party. And the result was that on the 2nd of March, an assembly was elected which for the first time in Northern Ireland's history does not have a Unionist majority in it, which is really a very, very big change. This is all context to why it's been difficult to reform the government in Northern Ireland. There have been negotiations between Sinn Féin and the DUP to re-establish an executive. Now, the issue that originally stopped the formation of the executive, which was Arlene Foster stepping down, that has gone by the board. Now, Sinn Féin are prepared to accept Arlene Foster as First Minister. But what the issue has now come down to is the Irish Language Act. And this goes back to the 2006 St Andrews Agreement. And in that agreement, the British government promised to introduce an Irish Language Act. So it's been a long time coming, and it hasn't happened. And there's been a lot of dissatisfaction amongst nationalists that there hasn't been an Irish Language Act. Now, I think Arlene Foster, to be fair to her, wanted to find a way around this problem. And a couple of weeks ago, it looked as if there was a deal, actually, between the two main parties. And then we had a radio show in which one of our kind of more controversial radio figures interviewed a language activist and said to this language activist, well, what would you like to see in an Irish Language Act? So the activist, being of a rather naive persuasion, said, well, yeah, he'd like more people to be made to learn Irish. That would be a good thing. And so the idea got spread about that an Irish Language Act would mean compulsory classes for everybody in Irish. And of course, that was totally impossible for Arlene Foster any longer to be associated with. So the whole thing collapsed very quickly. And opinion has now hardened very much on both sides. On the Sinn Féin side, demanding that there be an Irish Language Act. On the DUP side, in opposition to an Irish Language Act. So we're in a bit of a mess and an impasse over this issue. Now, normally what would happen in these circumstances is the British government would step in, and indeed one way out would be for the British government to enact an Irish Language Act. After all, the British, in the St Andrews Agreement, it was the British government that promised to introduce an Irish Language Act. But the problem is that as a result of the general election in the UK, in June last year, when Theresa May lost her majority, she's become dependent on the votes of members of the Democratic Unionist Party. So she's not in a position to introduce an Irish Language Act at Westminster. So we're now in a thorough bind. I don't know what the way out of this is. It should be said, I mean, I'll now go back to the original question. Sorry to divert. To go away from it. But the atmosphere has improved enormously in Northern Ireland since 20 years ago. There's been a great relaxation. There is a sense in that the fear has been lifted, and it's very important. But there are some caveats. People are still kind of reluctant to go into the neighborhoods of the other community. My daughter, who sees herself as an outsider, although she was born in Belfast, she's quite happy to float between the different neighborhoods. But she finds that when she works with people from the different communities, they most definitely are not prepared to visit her if she's in the wrong neighborhood. So there's still difficulties. There's still kind of what I call a force field in Northern Ireland, where there's a sense that the threat of violence hasn't completely disappeared and could come back. I think that's probably enough for the moment from me.
Thank you, Professor Guelke. Professor O'Leary, Professor Deiana, would you like to?
Okay, yes. I'm going to perhaps take a longer look and as you mentioned, my interest has always been in the context of Northern Ireland in relation to women's roles within the conflict and later within the peace process. So the Good Friday Agreement actually is usually talked about as a success story in relation to the participation of women within the process. Most notably because of the participation of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, who was a party that represented a wide range of women's interests and also was able to kind of garner all of the experiences of women's activism throughout the conflict. So through their participation during the negotiations, which was in itself quite remarkable, they were able to actually intervene within the process in a number of ways, most notably through the incorporation of gender equality provisions within the text of the agreement under the famous Section 75. And they also managed to contribute to with the creation of a proposal for a civic forum, which was kind of like an alternative consultation process involving civil society, which was very much something that the Women's Coalition and more generally the women's sector in the civil society was very keen to achieve. So, I mean, this was, it's undeniable that this was a remarkable success, because otherwise the process would have been very much male-dominated, and the experiences of women and activists who have been quite literally holding the communities together throughout the conflict, dealing with the aftermath of violence, dealing with mental health issues and so on, which were very much as a result of the conflict. So this was absolutely remarkable. However, when we look at the implementation of the agreement, actually the results are less remarkable, and the outlook is again less positive. This is because throughout the implementation of the agreement, gender equality actually ended up receding from the political agenda, because many of the other contentions were actually not resolved. So, for instance, when, as you mentioned, during the renegotiation of the agreement, the contestations around policing, the contestation around the composition of the government took precedence, and so gender equality kind of fell off the agenda inevitably. So it is a mixed verdict in relation to the success from a gender perspective. So what has happened is that essentially there was not, given that gender equality did not remain high in the political agenda, that there were not specific mechanisms produced in order to translate those commitments and incorporate them into the various issues of contention. So in the text of the agreement and in the implementation, there were not mechanisms introduced in order to address the gendered legacy of conflict, how conflict impact diversely both men and women, and diversely positioned in the communities. There were not, a gender perspective was not included in many of the key issues, such as police reform, the rehabilitation of combatants, and so on. And so in many ways, these kind of created a disjunction between, on the one hand, the provision for gender equality, and then the peace-building agenda, which continued to be dealt with through gender-blind lenses. And one of the problems, which is something that we feminist scholars are trying to draw attention to, in relation to the power-sharing institutions and to the perhaps unexpected outcomes of these instruments, is the fact that through by focusing specifically on ethno-national identities and trying to reconcile those ethno-national identities, they've also had an implicit outcome of entrenching ethno-nationalism as the main political discourse. And this leads inevitably to kind of sideline any other aspects, including gender, and also to reproduce some of the gender stereotypes and power relations which are embedded within these discourses. So that is one of the key problems that actually we feminist scholars and activists in Northern Ireland are trying to draw attention to. There is also another dimension that I think it's worthwhile considering, and is the fact that with the inclusion of gender equality provision within Section 75, this actually had somehow ironically, a counterproductive effect, because in many ways it gave the impression that gender equality was resolved, that we didn't need to address those kind of issues. Gender equality is done, we have it included in the agreement, why should we care now? And so this has been, again, another unexpected effect. And then if we look at the various examples of, the agreement and the peace process have been characterized by multiple deadlocks, political contentions, and so on. And in those moments, again, issues and contentions around the two communities have taken the fore of the political agenda, and this has meant that gender equality issues have continuously been sidelined. So, for instance, in 2013, there were, it was a moment of tension within Northern Ireland. There were tensions around cultural issues, around the flags, around discontent within the loyalist community. This led to another round of negotiations. Women tried to participate to the consultations that were held in Northern Ireland. Women from all the communities, they submitted their perspective, and yet in the final report that was produced as a result of those consultations, gender was not necessarily addressed. And the resulting commission that was created was, I think that the composition was of 14 men and 1 woman, which I think gives certainly an indication. And so again, I think that if we look at the Good Friday Agreement and the 20 years, it is, we need to kind of take a somber look at some of the gendered underpinnings of the process. So I'll finish here.
No, thank you, Professor Deiana. Let me ask you just a quick follow-on before we turn to Professor O'Leary. There's a significant debate in the United States, for example, about gender representation in our legislature at the national or at the state levels. What is your sense of the proportionality in Northern Ireland between male and female members of the Stormont Assembly? And is there any provision, for example, as in France, I think there's and I can't recall quite how this works, but there's the parité, the equality effort by some of the parties, I believe, to ensure that you have an equal number of female and male candidates, and ultimately would better representation of women in the Northern Ireland Assembly, would that address some of the things that you're talking about?
Okay, that's a great question, which is actually highly contested within feminist scholars as well. The representation of women has improved. I think we have 30% in the last election in Stormont. But I think, we should be very clear, it's not a panacea. And actually, if we look at the way in which gender equality was included within the agreement, it really highlights some of the key tensions here, that it suggests that actually simply thinking about formal representation is not enough. Of course, we should strive for gender equality, we should strive for equal representation. I think it is important, it is a value that we should be certainly promoting, but at the same time, this is not enough, particularly if we continue to think about gender equality as somehow not connected with deploying a gender approach to addressing the legacy of conflict, which was inherently gendered. Also, if we think about another example, if we think about the current situation, so the leaders of both the DUP and Sinn Féin and another major party, the Alliance Party, they are women at the moment.
Indeed, your ingratitude is remarkable.
And I mean, of course, again, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't, we shouldn't strive for equal representation. But again, first of all, there is not enough. And secondly, I mean, do we assume that women will necessarily represent the interest of women? I mean, there is a tension, and also, I mean, in Northern Ireland, there is also a tension between the gender identity and then also the identity of the party that they have to represent. So in my view, I think that I believe that we should strive for that, but it's not enough if we do not take gender seriously and we continue to think about peace building as somehow something that we can continue to do without paying attention to gender.
Thank you. Professor O'Leary.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, Rich, and Leanne, thank you. It's a pleasure to be in Florida. Unlike the others, I have no excuse. I came from Philadelphia, so I have no jet lag. The first thing to note about the Good Friday Agreement and its consequences in comparative terms is, as Adrian suggested, is how remarkably successful it has been. If we take the standard political science definition of what constitutes an end to combat, less than 25 battle-related deaths per annum, Northern Ireland unquestionably meets this standard. Usually you hear massive amounts of ingratitude, and with respect, Maria belongs to the category of those who are deeply ungrateful. And the reason she's deeply ungrateful is because she has unrealistic expectations of any peace agreement. And of any political settlement. Of course, the Northern Ireland regime is not a feminist paradise. The conflict in Northern Ireland was not about gendered questions, though 9 out of 10 of the victims, in terms of deaths, were males, not females. The incidence of direct physical injury was primarily experienced by males rather than females. Females suffer more in the long run from the conflict if they've been deprived of their partners, their fathers, their brothers. And that's true of all wars. Northern Ireland is not distinctive in this particular respect. A second way in which the agreement was remarkable was that its institutions, consociational institutions, that is to say, power-sharing arrangements in the executive, proportionality, self-government for each community in its own schooling arrangements, and veto rights in the assembly, these have broadly worked as realists anticipated, not as people who might have had other expectations might have anticipated. The agreement eventually reached at in St. Andrews actually produced a remarkably interesting compromise in which the parties to the agreement, with the strong prompting of the British and Irish governments, modified the agreement to make it work better for themselves. There have been subsequent modifications of the agreement agreed by the parties. It was never the case, for example, that opposition was outlawed. Opposition was always possible. It's now been facilitated. So the actual institutions, by and large, worked remarkably well, particularly for a decade. That is not to say that they produced stunning, novel legislation, but they weren't bad, particularly by comparison with Scotland and Wales, as Dr. Connolly himself has demonstrated in some of his work. So the institutions haven't been at all unsuccessful. The North-South Ministerial Council has not been an engine for delivering a united Ireland by the back door, as unionists feared. To the contrary, many of its potential initiatives have been cramped by the veto power that unionists enjoy over its development. The British-Irish Council, brought into existence with great fanfare, has been little more than an occasion for general summitry. It's not been a significant institution. So the situation in which we're presently in, that Adrian described, might be seen as an indictment of the institutions, but I think myself it's largely due to contingent consequences of what I call Ukexit. Brexit is a misleading abbreviation. There is no such place as Britain. There is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Great Britain voted to leave the European Union. Northern Ireland did not. Inside Great Britain, there was a division between the Scots and the English and the Welsh. The policy of taking the whole of the UK out of European institutions is what is triggering deep tensions and re-triggering internal ethno-national tensions in Northern Ireland. I must correct Richard. The nationalists voted very solidly to remain inside the European Union. By contrast, unionists voted to leave, not by the same degree, not to the same degree to which nationalists endorsed remaining, but nevertheless that was their general pattern. Now, in questioning, I hope we'll explore that question further, but I would say that has created deep tensions. One, the Democratic Unionist Party got what it wanted ideologically, leaving Europe, emphasizing the sovereignty of Westminster, but had done no preparation for. It did not expect to win. It got an ideological free ride on the referendum and then suddenly had to cope with the consequences. Sinn Féin backed the European Union, again a sign of its incorporation into a modernized politics. Historically, Sinn Féin had been a Eurosceptic party. Over time, that's significantly changed. Both of these major parties have seen opportunities to depart from the previous equilibrium created by what I call Ukexit. The DUP look upon this as an opportunity, particularly as they're temporarily in government at Westminster, to either wind back or slow some of the consequences of the agreement. Internally, many of their cadres would prefer a hard border across the island of Ireland, cementing the difference. They can't say this publicly because most of their constituents recognize the practicality of having a soft border, but that's their core preference. And by contrast, within Sinn Féin, there is an understandable strategic appreciation of the opportunity created by this moment, because it's not that a united Ireland will arrive through unionists so loving Europe that they'll vote to join Ireland in order to depart from a decaying United Kingdom, however rational that assessment might be. It's rather that what Ukexit will do is to transform the position of Northern Catholics, who by and large, by that I mean in terms of local majority opinion, the Catholics were quite content with the settlement. Not extraordinarily content, but content. What being taken out of the EU against their will and prospectively reducing their living standards and career prospects and all the attendant benefits of European Union membership will do over the long run, I think, is to make them much more solidly in favour of Irish reunification. Underlying the story that we're all talking about is a demographic change story. At the time of the negotiation of the agreement, in which I played a minor role, one of the reasons why unionists made a significant power sharing settlement was that they anticipated that their demographic and eventually their electoral majority status was going to be eroded. And they made a prudent decision to create power sharing arrangements. What's happening right now is the consequences of that configuration of demographic change and the institutions that were previously agreed upon. It's now the case that in schools, cultural Catholics are a majority. It's now the case that Catholics are a majority in 4 of the counties of the original 6 counties. It's now the case that cultural Catholics, stroke nationalists, are a majority in the historic city of Belfast, or at least the plurality party expected shortly to be the majority party. If you tried to repartition Northern Ireland into a clearly Protestant area and a clearly Catholic area, you could not produce a sensible territorially contiguous map. So we're in this very interesting equilibrium in which Catholics are about to go past Protestants demographically. It's still not the case that they've gone past them electorally, but I'm predicting that one of the consequences if you Ukexit will be to increase Catholic participation and to increase their nationalism. So that's how I would paint the broad structural picture. Now, I said at the beginning that these things have a lot to do with expectations. I'm a realist. Consociationists pride themselves on being realists. What do they mean by that? Taking people as they are, not as you would like them to be. and building institutions in the light of that fact. Here's a remarkable statistic. Do you know what the average lifetime of the constitution of a sovereign state is across the planet? Have a guess. That's a very, very bad guess, but thank you. Yes? That's a really pessimistic guess. The average lifetime of the constitution of a sovereign state is 20 years. The Good Friday Agreement has not yet been destroyed. I don't think it will be destroyed. It has survived the average lifetime of a world constitution. And if you go back to the way people thought about Northern Ireland in the 1980s and the 1990s, that should be put in perspective. That's a remarkable achievement. The reasons why I think the agreement will come back on board are largely related to the underlying balance of forces within Northern Ireland. There is no basis for imposing some kind of adversarial political system. And if that were to happen, Unionists might find themselves in a remarkable position because Nationalists would align with the Alliance Party and with other small parties on certain key questions related to gender questions, marital relations among gay people, and so on. So the DUP will vigorously want to maintain the consociational institutions. So for these long-term and short-term reasons, I expect the Good Friday institutions to come back online, but I don't expect them to come back online until the UK's exit from the European Union is sorted. And it's extraordinarily difficult to predict how that sorting is going to work, not least because there's a totally incompetent government in London. And I think that's an objective judgment. That's not some kind of partisan statement. We still don't know precisely what they envisage as their final end goal. But perhaps rather than speaking at length on this particular topic, we can bring it into general discussion. Thank you for my opening remarks.
Thank you, Professor O'Leary. Professor Guelke, on the question of Brexit, would you like to add any thoughts on what the implications are?
He refuses to learn. It is not Brexit. If it were Brexit, we Irish would not object because it would simply be Britain leaving, Great Britain. It's the whole of the UK being taken out, including Northern Ireland, against its will. That's why UKexit is the appropriate abbreviation. It's not hard to say. UKexit.
I can't say
UKexit. I think I've
got it. I'm going to
got
stick with Brexit, I'm afraid. I take your point. I take the spirit of your point entirely. No, I think that Britain leaving the EU or the UK leaving the EU is a huge problem for the agreement. I mean, unquestionably. There are, and I'm going to be talking about that tomorrow, but there are two more general kind of sort of mood points I want to make about the current situation in Northern Ireland, which I think are troubling about the way the agreement is operating. Not so much to do with the agreements, it's more to do with broader cultural issues, I guess, actually, and to do with media questions, which are really quite important as well. There is a total preoccupation in Northern Ireland in the media with the past. We're refighting the Troubles. Every episode of the Troubles gets gone over and over again. It's, a colleague of mine said it's like trying to drive a car by looking in the rear view mirror all the time. This is not a good way to drive a car. Yeah, you occasionally want to look in the rear view mirror, but fixedly, trying to drive fixedly looking in the rear view mirror is not I think that is a rather good metaphor. There's a total preoccupation with the past rather than looking towards the future, and that is a problem. Another problem that I think that the prospect of the UK leaving the EU is causing is that there's been a return to kind of zero-sum thinking. The assumption of unionists, if something is bad for nationalists, that is good for unionists, and vice versa. And that's a very destructive frame of mind to exist. And we were overcoming it, sort of 4 or 5 years ago, I think that there was a view in unionism that actually the Republic of Ireland overcoming its economic troubles was good for Northern Ireland. There was an assumption there of interdependence, and that it was whereas now the unionists are very much trying to pick a fight with the Republic of Ireland all the time, particularly over the issue of the European Union. So we're in fairly negative territory in terms of the mindsets that currently prevail, and that is a problem.
Thank you. Professor Deiana, did you have some final thoughts on
Brexit?
Brexit?
Oh, okay. Yes, again, I mean, I'm going to be speaking from the perspective of the real women, the ungrateful women. So, yes,
Ideal women, I think, is your perspective, not real women.
I don't think so. I mean, I attended a number of consultations with representatives of civil society. I've been involved with civil society organizations, mostly women. And, I mean, they have very... like Adrian was saying, they are concerned about the prospects of Brexit on a number of issues. Firstly, there are questions around the human rights legislation, and that those small gains that were achieved could be reversed. There is a question of funding, because a lot of the resources for peace-building projects were coming from the European Union, and many of the grassroots organizations, women's civil society groups, were actually among the beneficiaries of these funds. And so this is a big issue, specifically because of the UK approach to social welfare and to the cuts that have been deployed in relation to funds available for civil society, again, and women's groups are among the ones who are going to be mostly affected. In terms of the longer terms implications, this idea of the zero-sum game is something that many women who are well positioned within different communities is something that they are constantly worrying about. They've seen an intensification of sectarianism. They've seen that renewed activity within paramilitary groups who have not disappeared, unfortunately, or they reinvented themselves through various activities which are not necessarily conforming to the law. And so, yes, this has produced certainly issues in relation to women's security within the community, and particularly for women who have been working across the divide. And this is something that certainly is causing a lot of concern. But also longer term, there is also the question of isolation. Many people, perhaps those who grew up, that they grew up in times of peace, they are worrying about the intensification of divisions. They felt that the European Union kind of offered the space for a more fluid identification. And now they are certainly worrying that we can see a return to much more entrenched kind of ideas around identity. So, yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. O'Leary?
I think one of the ways of understanding current complexities is to look at the draft withdrawal agreement of the negotiations between the EU 27, including Ireland, and the United Kingdom. In that draft agreement, there is a protocol, and that protocol is in white. That is to say, it is not agreed by all the negotiating parties. It is, however, entirely agreed by the EU 27, including Ireland. And what that protocol does is to say that in the absence of an agreement between the UK and the EU 27 to prevent the erection of a hard border again across the island of Ireland, then backstop arrangements will go into place. What do these involve? They actually involve what a rationalist would think of as an intelligent compromise, given that Northern Ireland voted to remain within the European Union. It would allow for Northern Ireland to have a special status, not called that, but it would be that. inside European arrangements. Northern Ireland would remain in the customs union of the European Union. It would remain in the regulatory structure of the European Union, and it would remain the beneficiary of most programs. So there is a question mark about some of the programs related to Interreg and peace. Now, what this does is to suggest that the borders that might be created as a result of the UK pursuing its declared governmental objectives would not take place on the land of Ireland, but in the Irish Sea. Now, administratively, and from, I would say, from a rational appraisal of the situation of the Northern Irish economy, that proposal makes a great deal of sense. But if you're a unionist, you of course are inclined to see it as the EU ganging up with Ireland to disrupt the wonderful sovereignty of the Westminster Parliament. Nationalists, of course, see things differently. So that cleavage is sitting there as a problem. What I love about it, with a sense of historical irony, is that 100 years ago, nearly 100 years ago, the UK forced a partition on the island of Ireland and forced Ireland to stay within the British Commonwealth of Nations rather than allowing it to become a republic. What we might have going forward is that the difficulties of resolving the Irish border question might force the UK as a whole into a soft exit rather than a hard exit. Because the only way Mrs. May can get her withdrawal treaty and avoid what's called the cliff edge is to have an agreement go through Parliament. And at the moment, it's difficult to see an agreement going through Parliament unless it's supported by the Democratic Unionist Party. So for that to happen, there would have to be no significant difference between the way in which Northern Ireland would be governed vis-à-vis European relations and the rest of the United Kingdom. So the implications of that are that the UK would have to remain within the regulatory structure of the single market, it would have to remain within the customs union, and it would have to accept the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice of the European Union. Now, in a way, if politics worked rationally, that would be a reasonable outcome. Why? Because the UK voted 52-48 to leave. That's a very close result. It's the result of bizarre contingencies that I'm happy to talk about tomorrow. But given the closeness of that result, there was never any legitimacy in a radical break from the EU. It wasn't what was put before the electorate. It wasn't clearly specified. And if there is to be an outcome that approximates the actual preferences, a soft exit might indeed be the optimal outcome. Having sketched a possible optimal and reasonable outcome, I do this frequently in my life. Do I anticipate that that will actually be achieved? Not with a high degree of optimism, but it's there as a possibility.
Thank you, Professor O'Leary. You remind me of something that I witnessed back in the early 90s when I was living in Canada doing my master's degree at McGill University in Montreal. There was a referendum on constitutional change, and it failed miserably when the Prime Minister went before the public and said, "Here's Canada, if you don't vote for this, I'm ripping it up." And 7 out of 10 provinces voted against it. 10 days later, he was out. There's a certain interesting quality, I think, as those of us who study politics, when we think about direct democracy, which is certainly a trend in the United States, at the state level anyway, to think about what do these outcomes mean when you have a very narrow vote in terms of something as weighty as staying or leaving the European Union. And I'd also say, just again to kind of put my professor cap on for those of you who are undergraduates or grad students, I've heard some interesting things this evening. The importance of what we might call bonding social capital. Right? How do communities in a post-conflict setting work together? What are the different roles in terms of gender? How can we bring people together? These are really important issues. as we think ourselves as Americans, we have a new administration which is trying to, I guess, renegotiate NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and has Justin Trudeau in knots, and I guess the Mexicans wondering about this border wall and so forth. These are all things that we also here in North America have to think about, and it's helpful to look at these developments through a comparative lens and see where we can come to some understanding, albeit in different contexts, definitely. But I want to thank my colleagues, number one, for all of their travel. It's stressful traveling these days. If you've noticed the last time you went to the airport, we have this outfit called the TSA, and we have lots of bag claims and baggage things we have to go through, and searches and all of this. Traveling's a big hassle, especially when you do it internationally and you're jet lagged by 5 or 6 or 7 hours. There's no excuse over here for Mr. O'Leary, because he came from Philadelphia. But seriously, I want to thank all of our conferees here this evening for coming here to the University of Florida, and again to all of those groups here at UF and I'd reiterate those: the Department of Political Science, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the Center for European Studies. We have Leo Villalon from the UF International Center. So those of you who are thinking about taking some trips abroad, he's a good man to see. UFI, well, he'll send you in the right direction, I guess is the best way. But seriously, UFIC has been very supportive, as well as other units here, and it's just been really an honor to have the folks here this evening. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll continue on tomorrow and see what we can learn about the situation in the North. So if
going to take questions?
Yeah, I think if Gail, do we have? No, are we?
I'm sure the panel will be glad to answer.
Yeah, we'll be happy to stick around here a bit, and if folks have questions, we'll stay here. But anyway, thank you for your attendance this evening, and thank you all of you for your participation. We appreciate it.